Okay, welcome to this 10th Urban Lunch Talk in JPI Urban Europe, and the first one of 2020. It is always a bit strange with these webinars because you don't get to meet and talk and mingle as you do before a normal meeting. So what we like to do in the beginning of webinars is that we have a look at who is attending today before we move on. And to do that, we will share a poll with you where you can vote. And it will appear on your screen very soon. There it is. So, JPI Urban Europe, we focus on urban dilemmas in research and innovation. And we are curious to see which dilemma is your favorite to work on. So please vote on one of these areas before we get going with the talk. We have digital transitions in urban governance. We have from urban resilience to robustness. We have sustainable land use and urban infrastructures. And we have inclusive public spaces for urban livability. Please tick one. Okay, and there are the results. The majority of you ticked inclusive public spaces for urban livability. That is my personal favorite too, but we also have a few digital transitions here. Not that many resilience or robustness oriented people here right now today. So now we know this, and we'll just have a brief look at today's topic. Suiting enough, it's called From Project Fraction to Synthesis Action. And we have a new and very important decade ahead of us, so it's time to step up the game. And knowing that we have another 10 years left to realize the Sustainable Development Goals and altogether make our cities ready for a sustainable future, urban issues tend to be wicked issues. And that means that there appears to be also a need for a mix of different types of knowledges and different types of knowledge practices, both academic knowledge, everyday experiences, lessons learned, taken for granted knowledge, or working experiences, and so on. In a synthesis process, we collect pieces from multiple sources. We reflect and interpret the findings. And the outcomes of a synthesis could help shape policies and practice. Some would argue that synthesis can shape narrative and a sense of direction, or even a sense of meaning. Maybe we need this for the coming decade. Having said that, we want to say hello to today's guests, who all operate synthesis in different ways in their work. So I suggest we bring them all on camera, and one at a time you'll be able to say a few words. Okay, I think everyone are here. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello. Hello.
Hi. Hello.
Thank you for making it here today. Let's go a bit around the table so everyone who tuned in can hear from you. Katarina Larsen, for example, you are from the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, that is correct. And you have a long experience from the research side, and most recently you worked on the synthesis report in the JPI Urban Europe Smart Cities call, where you, for instance, interviewed municipalities or urban stakeholders who were part of this research call. So very welcome, Katarina. Would you like to say a few words?
Yes, I can say, briefly introduce myself. As Caroline said, I'm working at the Royal Institute of Technology, and I'm based at the Division for History of Science, Technology and Environment. And the reason for my involvement in this synthesis report is an initiative by the director of KKH to increase collaboration with some strategic partners, where IQ Samhällsbyggnad is one of them. So I've been working with interviews with both representatives from municipalities, but also by interviewing and talking to researchers and research institute representatives that have been involved in the project for smart cities and communities in JPI Urban Europe. So it's been very interesting to hear what their experience had been from working with these projects for a couple of years now.
Yes, thank you, Katarina, and we will hear more about that later on, I'm sure. How about we turn to you, Jamal?
Hi.
Hi, welcome.
Thanks.
You previously carried out research on how to optimize dialogue between disciplines to ensure relevant and useful research can help critique and design and improve policy. And your project parent was granted funding in the JPI Urban Europe call on smart cities. And a little while ago, you and some more projects got together for some synthesizing efforts. What would you like to say to start with?
That's right. Can you hear me? Because
Yes.
I can't see me. Okay. All right. So yeah, I'm Jamal Shahin. I am working at the Vrije Universiteit Brussel in Belgium. And yes, we worked on the parent project, which is nothing to do with children, and is all to do with participatory energy management, which is why it was, which is why it had that acronym. The project itself was looking at how to engage with citizens at the urban level in reducing their household electricity consumption. And as a result of this project, which was across several different countries, so we worked in the Brussels region, we worked in Amsterdam, and we worked in Bergen in Norway, we started to think more about how do we actually diffuse the results of these projects or these different activities beyond the area that we were, the localities we were working in. And so we got together with a couple of other projects at one of the final conferences organized by JPI Urban Europe. And we said, well, wouldn't it be good if we could actually talk about how to think more about this diffusion and how we can start to really share the ideas and the lessons that we've learned, but in a much more systematic way, or in a way that can be more useful. So in a synthetic way, as we talk about here in this webinar, across. So we organized a workshop in November last year in Maastricht, and we brought together 3 different institutions as the coordinating organization. So Maastricht University, Drift, in Rotterdam, and also ourselves in Brussels. And we brought together participants who've been engaged in different urban living labs or smart city projects to try and talk about what we mean by diffusion. And I guess we'll go into more details during the webinar. Thanks.
Surely. Thank you, Jamal. Okay, let's turn to Lisa Boni. You are the Secretary General of EUROCITIES, the network of local and municipal governments of major European cities. And with long experience in EU policy and the field of local and regional governments, you also have your hands on a big chunk of different types of knowledges and know-how. Welcome, and what would you like to tell us about this?
Okay, do you hear me?
Very well.
Okay, great. So, as I said, I'm the Secretary General of EUROCITIES since 6 years, more or less, but I've been working with local authorities and regional authorities dealing with Europe, basically all my career, with a parenthesis in the European Parliament to better understand the European, let's say, work. So, in EUROCITIES, but in general, all the work that I've been doing during my career was about trying to make sense of the, huge and sometimes very different information and diverse information for local authorities on one side and for Europe on the other side. So it's been about making synthesis a lot, of course, but in a way also translating. I'm not talking about language, of course, but really about the concepts, and trying always to create knowledge where the answer to the questions, what's in it for me, is always present, sort of logic. And that's, for me, the biggest challenge of this kind of work, working with so much information. So transforming information into meaningful knowledge for whatever target audience or target stakeholders you want to achieve, you want to reach. So in our cases, but I can go deeper afterwards, because it's really our daily bread, basically.
Yes.
It's not one project, let's say.
Yes. It's a way of doing the whole thing. Yeah. Okay, thank you all three. We've heard a bit how you approach today's topic. Briefly, you can explain more in a bit. Let's have a look at how the registrants understood this topic, because you who's listening now, you could submit some questions or reflections that we could have a look at, and we just gathered all of these things that you told us when you registered on a slide here. And the guest, you've had a look at this a little bit in advance. I highlighted here on the left side 3 sort of questions that you could attend to. And you who's listening to this now, you can also help respond to this and help each other make sense of it by typing in the chat. But I'm actually just gonna open the floor to the 3 of you and see if you want to jump on any of these questions. Katarina,
Could I start?
Melissa? Yeah, Jamal, you're eager.
Okay. Being first has the advantage of then you can say anything and everybody has to agree. So, I mean, I'm not going to respond to one of the points specifically, but one thing I wanted to raise that came also, I think will address some of these points, and came out of our workshop, was that in order to have a conversation about how you can diffuse projects or the results or the initiatives and so on, you need to ensure that you're talking the same language, or at least be aware that there is a plurality of language usage out there. So we have to focus quite a bit on terminology and understand what we mean by diffusion, what we mean by synthesis, what we mean by fragmentation, and actually trying to encapsulate the richness that comes in all of the different disciplinary backgrounds. I mean, I'm talking as an academic researcher here, and how we can actually bring that richness into a discussion that actually helps develop strategies for policymakers. So I think one of the things is really ensuring that when we start talking about fragmentation across different municipal administrations, or even within one municipal administration, we're talking about the same thing. We had a good example in our workshop from Maastricht, from the city of Maastricht, where different departments were trying to, I mean, I hope nobody from Maastricht is here because I'm probably misrepresenting it, but different departments were trying to do different types of urban living lab activities. and they were dealing with them in completely different ways. And this was fine, but they needed some kind of common framework to be able to understand each other and to be able to then deal at the city level. And so they developed a very simple system where they had different colors that they would put into their Excel sheets to identify different types of targets and different types of objectives and so on. And this kind of helped them develop that. That's maybe just one way of thinking about this, ensuring that the terminology is right. I don't know if that's an issue that the others have come across.
So I can add to that, and in my work at KTH here in Stockholm, I also meet a lot of engineering students. We have courses also for international students coming to KTH to spend some time here and doing a semester or a full education program. So it's also very interesting to hear their view on what the different challenges are for different cities, comparing what they experience in the context of Stockholm and based on their experiences from their home cities. So one of the approaches for the work I've done in interviewing both researchers but also representatives from municipalities and public agencies is to learn about more how they talk about these projects. What are the project narratives that they communicate? What are the experiences? Both to learn more about what motivated the participants to join the projects in the first place. And also to recognize that even though the incentives for joining a project consortium can be very different, it can turn out to be a very constructive and interesting dialogue about these challenges that we see in cities. So I would say both learning about the motives of the participants of the projects has been very interesting to hear more about. But also learn about what kind of insights they have had throughout the project process, that there were some objectives and goals formulated, but also some insights along the road. One example from the projects that I talked to was working with congestion charges, how you can increase the accessibility in the city by implementing some incentives for reducing the traffic. And experience from the Stockholm case was also shared with city representatives in New York throughout the project period. So some of the outcomes of the project can be planned beforehand, but there are also unexpected impacts that arise throughout the project. So that's also been part of the process in interviewing both the researchers but also the representatives from the municipalities to hear more about what they expected, both from the project themselves but also from involving different types of users.
Yeah, I was struggling to try and select which an example of on how to respond to these questions. So one of these questions is more about what I said before. Maybe it's like trying to have a set of recommendations, for instance, that are useful for both local authorities and the EU in this case on a specific topic that concerns, a challenge that local authorities face. Yeah, now I don't know, I'm thinking of integration of migrants at the local level. That's a topic, it's very general, but just to pick one, it's a challenge that municipal administrations, need to tackle, because it's very much at their level that this is happening. Migration is a global phenomenon, but it's really happening at the local level. And at the same time, so there is there is quite a strong need for cities to understand how this is done in an innovative way and an efficient way and a participatory way in different realities across Europe. And on the other side, you need to get knowledge to be used for the EU to change EU policy and make it more useful for the local authorities, if you see what I mean. So it's a double, let's say, aim. So, for instance, in our case, it would be about organizing a collection of how cities do, so like policies / projects / initiatives that, you know, local authorities do around integration of migrants by organizing it in a way, so collecting the information in a way that is the same for everyone. So it's very basic. So like, I don't know, how do you organize your housing policy? How do you organize your education, your, you know, all the levels of integration, for instance? How do you make sure that the local population is part of the process and so on? And you have, I don't know, 20, 30 cities responding to that, make an analysis and a synthesis of all that. So in a way, it's useful for the local administrations to read all things, so to hear about these different ways of doing things in order to understand if their policies is, you know, missing something or is actually, yeah, adding something and so on. And at the same time, you can extract a sort of trend as well of the main issues that are, you know, emerging from big cities in that field. And that sort of, for instance, call it report, call it whatever you want, that document, you make it available to the EU institutions, and for instance, DG Home in this case, who would see that actually cities then need access to funding in a direct manner and not going through national governments because they have these needs and this is how they do and so on. So it's like trying to make with one, with so many information and so different realities across Europe, one single message that can be useful to both cities and the EU. And that's, you know, that's a piece of paper. But at the same time, what we also want to do and what we do a lot is to make this, let's say, information available in a way that it becomes very concrete, and then can, by going through a sort of transfer process from a city to other cities, for instance, through peer reviews and other things like that, you can actually then achieve like policy change at the local level. So, but that's not only a matter of having a document, it's really a matter of having a sort of methodology for learning, for mutual learning. So I don't know if I answered.
Yeah, I think you're touching upon this, both skills and capabilities, but also some success factors in this knowledge transfer that many wonder about. It's not necessarily a linear transfer of knowledge, but it's something that happens in a circular way, and as you say, using a certain methodology, perhaps. Katarina and Jamal, how do you recognize what Anna-Lisa is talking about?
Yeah, I would say partly also one of the insights from the interviews with the city representatives was how they're viewed upon learning from similarity and learning from differences. How did they benefit from being in projects with cities or city representatives that were from a similar context when it had to do with working with energy plans and energy strategies for that? So I think just recognizing that it's a very different thing, learning from a city context which is very similar to what you're working with yourself, but also recognize what can you learn from making this type of comparison between contexts that are not similar. So there was one voice from one of these projects that the selection of project participants had to be well thought through, and if you are comparing a smaller city to a larger city, or a city which has a different political governance setup. It's something that you need to take into account also when you discuss what are the expected learning outcomes, if you talk about it in those terms.
Yeah.
Yeah. May I? Because I completely agree that there's this issue of transferability, or when you're looking at comparable cities. So, you know, comparing a very large city with a different governance structure to a very small town makes for a challenging transfer process. One other thing that we've discussed in more detail also in this workshop that we held last November is the idea of the dynamics of diffusion there. What are the motives? I think, Katarina, you talked about the motives in your first intervention. I think that's very important. Why are people actually wanting to learn from others? What is it they're trying to achieve with this? And that discussion needs to be had also very early in the process of selecting your partners or selecting your cases or your test beds, so that you can actually ensure that people are looking for the same thing. We had that experience in our project, which was about citizen participation in reducing household energy consumption. We had this dual dialogue, or this dual narrative of reducing your electricity bill and saving the planet at the same time. And actually this became quite problematic in the end, because people would either think of one of the narratives as being much more dominant, and we thought we could ride the wave between the two, but in fact it becomes quite problematic when thinking of the final objectives of your work. So we had this issue of, you know, having the debate about why are we doing this project, why are we doing this initiative, and how do we actually communicate that with all of our other partners, as being one of the biggest discussion points that we should have had right at the beginning, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe to build on that, because that's really the basic ingredient, is to know what you want to get out from it. And again, as I said before, just to go deeper into what I was saying in our sort of peer learning meetings, you know, your classical exchange of experience meeting would be just, you know, PowerPoint, I tell you what I do, you tell me what you do, but then everyone goes home and that's it. It's not a form of a project, but still it's a lot of our activities, you know, in our network. So how we've managed to change that in the last few years and make it more, in a way, useful and impactful. It was really like to have a proper, you know, identification by a call on the issue. For instance, I don't know, preventing evictions and homelessness. I'm just inventing. So you have a discussion with the group on the issue. Everyone is interested in the issue. Everyone is ready to understand, to learn. So that's and everyone is looking at it with the shared objective of taking something out of it and transferring it to its context. So having a sort of policy change. So then what happens? There is the sort of, you know, you choose also the city that wants to present its own practice. Let's say, I don't know, in this case, I remember we had done Vienna, who, you know, did site visits, interviews, and, you know, a package of knowledge and information on that specific issue. And then through that, you organize a real, I would say, structured and very well organized set of information around the challenges, the success factors. So you don't give everyone, you say, okay, just talk about it. Really giving a very clear structure for the information and going into the detail. I don't know, there is no sufficient housing stock, or I don't know, there's a mismatch between the legislation and the actual needs and local circumstances and so on. What really works well is the governance, we can do it, and things like that. And really trying to have them very clearly. And then having those cities that really commit to say, okay, we'll draft an action plan on that basis to push forward and to solve the same issue that we have. We have this issue, we'll put together an action plan on the basis of these ideas. And then you do a follow-up with them, who has done the action plan, what have been the difficulties in drafting it up, or in terms of having the ownership of the political setting, or the issue of really understanding if locally it makes sense or what is missing. So it's a continuous, very concrete commitment of getting to the final goal, which is about changing your own policy. So you don't leave it halfway, you just actually go towards the final result. Because that's also, I think it's one of the questions in the thing, that's also the problem with projects. You start, you do it, and then the results stay in a drawer, and there's no actual money or investment or resources to do the follow-up. And while the follow-up is the most important aspect, has that project managed to have an impact, well, in our case, in this specific case, on another city, on how many cities, and what were the learnings from that. So it's a real challenge to continue extracting learnings from a process of learning.
Yeah.
It's what you said before,
learning.
Circular, but it's really about having a clear objective in mind, and a group of people that are really interested in the subject and are committed to do it, even without huge resources from a EU project. You see what I mean?
Jamal, Katarina, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I think also some of the interviews done also were curious about this, what came out from the project from the perspective of the project participants. And some experiences there was also that the projects created a space for looking more closely into what the user perspectives were in reality, not just a box you tick in an application, but learning more about what is the format that works for capturing energy related data for the municipality, which in turn led to a follow-up project. So that's another type of effect that you can see from these initiatives, that they create a space for having this type of dialogues with the actual users, not just the users that you talk about. So that was something that was forwarded from some of the dialogues I had with the project partners. So rather than seeing users as something you are supposed to involve in this multi-stakeholder partnership that is mentioned as a criteria for the projects, to learn more about what type of knowledge do the users have, to look at them as knowledge carriers rather than informants that you talk to after the project is finished. So that's one point that I wanted to bring to the table here as well.
Yeah. Do you think that, and I'm asking all three of you, but could and is synthesis more than simply adding up knowledge and bits of data and getting an overview?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
definitely, because it's really, that's why before I talked about synthesis, but it's more about, for me, it's really about translation. Translation from the perspective, in terms of the perspective of the person you want to make this knowledge useful for. And that for me is the biggest issue. And it's really not about just communication, so that it's simple, and sometimes it has to be complicated, but it has to have you know, what's in it for me in there. So if you don't have that, then you know, the synthesis will be completely useless. And it, you know, translating a Green Deal or you know, a sort of whatever EU policy position to a local level or to a local administration is, you know, it's a big job because you permanently have to translate that into the local context. Why, in what ways this information is useful for you, or things like that. So it's really about making sure that there is a sort of usefulness in what you do.
It sounds like there's a add-on of strategic element to it. Yeah. Jamal, do you want to say something?
Yeah, okay. And I was just thinking about how we think about this synthesis idea, because for me, synthesis can be across cities, as we've heard from Annalisa. It can also be across policy fields. So it can be that there is a kind of a synthesis of what happens in the energy field that then moves into the mobility field or into another field within a specific city. And I think that's also one thing that we need to think about. Also then, Annalisa was talking about how we make this link between what happens at the city level and what happens at the EU level. Synthesis does also build up a body of knowledge that goes towards different levels as well. So it can be at the regional level, the national level, and the European level. And I think that's important to think there also about these different ways in which synthesis takes place. Right? So it's not just about going from one city to another city. It's not about one project to another project, but it's also about thinking, how does this actually change the mentality or the approach of the participants that have been involved in one of these projects, and how can we actually build that into thinking about transformation in a slightly different way. And there, I think one of the things that we discussed in our workshop was also this idea of the observatory. So the common kind of, as I mentioned before, a common kind of framework that helps us understand what and how these processes change. It's not just about the outcomes and learning about the outcomes and developing this synthesis of outputs, but it's also about understanding all these different kind of dynamics that go on and processes that go on and how those change due to interactions with different levels, different policy fields, and different cities. And so on.
And yeah, and what we can see here is that the topic of synthesis as a topic, it takes many directions for different people. And the experience of working with it can in itself be quite messy. I suggest, yeah, Annalisa.
If I just would like to complete exactly what Jamal said, because I mean, one of the things we experience is, you know, this sort of the big virus of the society. I find is like this silos approach that, you know, is not corresponding anymore to, you know, a way to address societal challenges and so on. Too complex now, that they are more complex, they are more interrelated, they're more cost-cutting. And so for administrations at all levels, not only local, it's a huge, probably the hugest challenge to have, you know, integrated planning, to have, you know, ways in which solutions can be, you know, developed in a much more integrated way, and where, you know, like innovation is a very clear example in that respect. You've got technological innovation, all types of innovation, including participatory and you know, social innovation and so on. So how do you have a sort of very sectorially driven machine respond to you know, knowledge organized around sectors? That's really the biggest thing. And when you, I mean, the answer that has been given for the moment by administrations is to set up task forces, horizontal, so everyone sees that. But as soon as you try and organize the machine around a more sort of challenge, I don't know, health or well-being that is way beyond your mobility or environmental element, economic element, so on, the transformation required is huge, and this really needs that's why I was wanted to refer to the transformation element that Jamal mentioned. It's really about how can knowledge help these types of transformation, which are really like deep and holistic and very complicated, and it's not easy to produce knowledge that helps that.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thought to perhaps use synthesis or focus on building synthesis as a way to break out of silos. That's an interesting to bring that up. Yeah, Katarina.
Yes, another comment to this is also thinking of synthesis as a way to mobilize for strategies and action, I think, because also I'm coming back to the interviews. They were, I think, the participants were also very willing to share their experience, and they felt an urgency to do that now that the projects are in the end phase or finalized. So one comment to this is that some of these projects, they emphasize the access to data, if it had to do with energy strategies in the municipality or have an overview of electricity consumption in urban areas. So making this type of synthesis could also be a way to join partnership between researchers and between representatives of municipalities to emphasize that some data that maybe you would not have access to before is necessary for making some strategic choices about what should be prioritized in urban areas. One practical example is strategic choices about should we have the focus on heat pumps or electricity station for electrical vehicles if there's a limited electricity supply for an urban space. So having these type of projects where local authorities and researchers partner up could also be a way to put pressure on, to emphasize that some access to key data is important to make some informed choices that will guide the direction for what type of cities we will live in the future and how we should achieve the ambitious goals that are set in different settings.
Yeah, and glancing at the future like that really relates to a narrative, whether a synthesis can contribute to that or not. Jamal, your pen is up.
Yeah, I'm waving my pen. It's really interesting that, because we were also, so you talk about narratives. One thing that we had reflected or thought about doing in our own project was actually start talking about scenarios. So really trying to get all the stakeholders that we could get around the table to actually think about where do they want the city to be in 20 years. And what we found, particularly in the Brussels region, we were working with two different local authorities. One, and again, I hope nobody's there. One that is politically rather stable, and the other one where elections do change things quite a lot. And what we noticed was that in the one that was politically more stable, there was this willingness to look far further into the future. So there is this issue of the dynamics, which I brought up before, that really show that in certain contexts, it's much easier to think far ahead into the future, whereas in other contexts, people are thinking about the next election. And I guess that ties into this idea of the limits or the barriers between doing bottom-up transformation and top-down transformation. And so where can citizen-led or stakeholder-led initiatives actually enforce or encourage transformation of the political system if the political system is subject to its own dynamics that don't get through.
I think that we're gonna nourish the talk a little bit more with what the attendees or you who participate, what are your experiences of working with synthesis? And we can do a second poll on this, because as we can hear, it can go many directions. So you're gonna see a poll on your screen, and we ask you to please explain your experiences of working with synthesis using maximum 3 words. And you can tick 3 boxes. So learning, transformation, complexity, reflexivity, innovation, interpretation, mixed knowledges, sustainability, wicked, that just makes me think about the musical right now, or other. And then you can specify in the chat. You can soon see what you vote on. So everyone who's listening can tick some boxes here. How do you view synthesis and what have you experienced so far? And in the meanwhile, maybe you, the guests here, because it relates to looking forward or thinking forward and narratives for cities. One question we got today was regarding city urban strategy ideas, or what makes a successful urban strategy. I'm just throwing it out there if you wish to comment on this, because I feel that the talk is heading that way anyway. So we will soon share the results of the poll.
Maybe
yeah.
Iki.
Keep going.
Iki. Also deserves a response. They they wrote this question about do we have around the table today any participant having synthesized cross-sector expertise with the commitment of non-expert citizens?
Yes, that's a question from the chat too.
Yeah, and I don't know, from our own experience, what we found, and I'm going to send you all a link to our own project's final report there. We found that in our final conference, not the final report, the final conference report, in our own conference, what we did was we tried to bring in addition to the people that had been working on our project, we tried to bring in a whole load of other community-based organizations to participate with small stands and so on in our final conference. That is not at all going along the synthesis. It's an attempt to show that there is space for synthesis in the future. So I just put the link up there as a promotion. Yeah. But you can see some nice photos of different community organizations working with us on the final conference.
Anna-Lisa, Katarina?
Yep. Well, for sure, I think, I don't know, I can't see the poll anymore, but I saw that there was a lot of learning ticked.
Learning ticks, yeah.
And I think that's one of the biggest element, I think. It's always useful, it's always, there's always something to learn from. If you go with the right mindset, of course, that you want to learn, always something you can pick that is useful for you. And also for both, if you receive the synthesis, but also if you do it, if you are the one who does the synthesis, because again, you have to make sure that what you put in there is useful. And that for me, and I get to the second point, it's complicated. It's complicated to do a synthesis. I can give an experience in terms of EUROCITIES, for instance, advocacy work. We have, nearly 200 cities, 150 are big, like over 250,000 inhabitants. The other are medium. Still, sometimes you have to prepare a position paper on a specific challenge, issue, or as a response to an EU policy document, and you have to put together, the views of such a diverse range of, realities, local realities. So making everyone contributes. So also the beginning of trying to when you collect the contribution, you have to make sure that people think with the same objective, in a way, around the same objective, what they want to contribute with. And even when you have all the contributions, then you have to make a synthesis that is definitely more than the sum of the parts. It has to be something that makes sense for everyone. It has to be something where you are interesting enough, or where you are not diluting sort of strong messages that may be present in there, and so on. So I find that the second point is really complicated, but at the same time, it really, really helps the collaboration. And the more, I think this is a more general issue about being European, the more you collaborate outside your normal ways of working, out of your comfort zone, outside your context, and the more you do cooperation, the more you'll be open to transform and to learn and to change.
Yeah. And I think we're soon going to go around the table again, and you can leave some of your final remarks. Let us know then, Jamal, if you want to share the map or not. Maybe not. So we'll soon hear from all of you again. We're going to also bring in our rapporteur. I'm just going to read the polls there a bit. Which was that because we're also recording this webinar so that it's available as an audio, and then you can't see the screen. So I'm just reading out loud here that learning was 54% who voted for that. We had mixed knowledges, 46%. We were also quite high on innovation, reflexivity, and complexity responses. Okay, what have we talked about here today? I think it is time for our rapporteur to say a few words. Are you there, Jonas? You're always traveling, but I know you should be there right now.
Well,
there you are.
I'm always where I am when I'm traveling as well. So that's
nowhere to find you. What did you hear in this talk?
Well, I would like to start actually, and then one of the later comments that Annalisa that you made, and I will try to wrap up, and it means that I will probably just repeat a lot of what you have been saying all the time. I'm not sure how much I will actually be synthesizing, but it's complicated to do a synthesis, and I think that is for me an entry point to why we JPI Urban Europe in the latest agenda, that we actually have a paragraph or so in our kind of implementation part, where we say that we actually have to get better at, or we have to develop ways of doing synthesis. Because, of course, if we look at it from the kind of research point of view, it was always kind of tricky to do interdisciplinary synthesis. Now, with sustainable urbanization today, what I think more and more actors are realizing is that you have to acknowledge and be very sensitive to a very diverse set of knowledge practices, not just a kind of academic knowledge with a capital K, so to speak, but actually, let's say from practitioners, that there are very different ways of, how you say, formalizing, or perhaps not always formalizing knowledge, but kind of transferring knowledge, and including lay persons, so to speak, if you look at the citizens' approaches and so on. So that's kind of the context for why we are very interested in what you had to say today, in order to kind of also help bring about a framework that is a bit more open and tries to characterize different types of synthesis that we may need in sustainable, well, urban sustainable transformations. So do I have a couple more minutes?
Yes.
Okay, because So I tried to listen to what you were talking about with at least 2 points, 2 different questions, actually a third one, but I'm not sure if I got time for that. But one is the kind of the role of synthesis today. And you were talking lots about that. So thank you, I'll get back to that. But also the various kinds of formats that would be required, that there are actually perhaps different types of formats on how to do synthesis and the shape that they take. It may not always be text. It could be audio-visual material that is a synthesis. There could be other formats such as workshops and so on. And you touched upon this in different ways. But interesting kind of core elements around this was the need for a harmonized or common language, as you, Jamal, were talking about the observatory or some such. Now, also around, for example, when you shape action plans in the kind of local level, local urban governance situation. So these 2 things got me thinking about whether, let's say, synthesis is issue-oriented when you have diverse actors who kind of share an interest in an issue. So that's one way to work with a synthesis, it seems. That might be interesting. But then you have, on the other hand, perhaps more synthesis as boundary objects, as you might say, when the synthesis itself becomes a platform where there was none before, perhaps, to shape and harmonize understandings. Well, harmonize not too much, but at least to have some kind of translation mechanism there. So I think that these are kind of my conceptual takes on this. Now, a lot of this seemed to revolve around making sense and learning about very complex issues. So I think that that's these issues. And also then the kind of third way of, not the third way, but something around the third question was, in what ways? Is it a daily practice or is it end of project? And I found that there was at least one kind of hybrid, Katarina, that you were talking about, that you found in the projects. And it was in accessing data and where actors are kind of partnering up and having this kind of future vision practice, if I understood it right. And I think that's an interesting way of perhaps not having it as a daily practice, but also not as a kind of an end of practice, end of project situation, but something that is kind of more common with regular intervals. And a kind of a practice that more and more actors then become used to doing. And the more we do it, the easier it will get, hopefully. Right? So I leave you with that. I have many more notes that you can see me, I'm looking at it. But,
thank you, Jonas.
Thank you very much for your sharing today.
Thank you, Jonas. And stay around in the chat for a little bit, so maybe we can keep talking there. Okay, let's just go around the table a bit, and you have a short takeaway that you would like to say. So let's, I don't know, should we start with Katarina and then Jamal and then Anna-Lisa, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start then, and as a takeaway from this talk, I would like to raise also the question about narratives have been brought to the table here, and as a scholar of studying organization and how they communicate their narratives, it's also here diving into how projects are describing their narratives. It's something that I will bring with me from this discussion. And another point is I noticed that reflexivity was also mentioned as one of the in the poll, one of the issues. So encouraging these type of consortiums to be also about reflecting a bit on what the expectations are on engaging with users in these type of projects. Seeing users as a data point or as knowledge carriers to open up that box a bit more. Something that I would also like to bring with me from this discussion.
Jamal?
Hey, yeah, quite a lot. and too much to make sense in 1 minute, but I'll try. I'll just pick up on maybe one or two things. I think that I was happy to hear that it is complicated for everybody else as well. This makes my life a bit more satisfying, because this idea that the way in which we actually try and synthesize, and the way in which we actually try and communicate these syntheses, the results of this synthesis, to others, needs, I mean, to me, to have this big question of expectation behind it, right? What do we really want to achieve with the synthesis? I think that's come out for me in quite a few of the discussion points that we've had. Tied to that, Jonas also mentioned this idea of different ways of displaying the results of these syntheses. So whether it's audio, visual, paper, whatever, I think that's very important to bear in mind, that not all of the outputs of these exercises are actually physical documents that we hold on to, but are probably a lot more about changes in beliefs, processes, trust, and so on and so forth. So this kind of synthesis exercise cannot be necessarily valued in the same way that we value traditional academic outputs. There you go. That's enough for a minute, I guess.
Yeah.
And building from this last comment, but also from the poll, I saw that responding to the questions, what's your experience of working with synthesis, the transformation element was totally zero, which means that, I mean, that's speaking, I think. That's speaking a lot in the sense that today syntheses are really just to help a little bit and so on, but they don't really make, they don't manage to help making a huge difference. And today, I think the challenges we have, I'm thinking of climate and digital and things like that, the sort of solutions we have to look at are, transformative. So need to be transformative. So whatever synthesis or whatever you call it, but knowledge that we need to get is really how to go to that extent, how to push to that, how to push the limits over, the sort of normal things, and therefore help people to engage in more transformative processes. And I think today we don't really manage, because we don't manage to put together points of view that come from academia, practitioners, or different points of view. It's always the academic on one side, the practitioners, the institutions, and things like that. So how can we do more of, the sort of cross-disciplined efforts and help transformation? But yeah, that would be the ideal where I would, try and
yeah,
the vision I would want to push for.
For synthesis to contribute to the transformations we need, in short. Yeah, and speaking of different formats, we'd like to leave you with a slide here to reflect on a little, because perhaps we need to work more with visualization and not just with text. So we're just going to let you rest your eyes on this while we round up. What synthesis could you draw from just studying this collage, or could you draw anything from just studying a collage of the city or the urban this way? But thank you for joining us today. We have Lisa Boni from EUROCITIES, Katarina Larsen, Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, and Jamal Shahin from the Parent Project and the Institute of European Studies. And thank you to all of you who tuned in and who's been talking here in the chat. We're going to join you there now and turn off our cameras and our audios. But thank you yet again. Happy weekend.
Yeah.
And, goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.